All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative with Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us today for Assisted Housing Inventory and the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, also known as the Shimber Center. Before I introduce our amazing speaker, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded, so if you registered, you're going to receive a copy of the recording and the link to the slides via email from Zoom within about 24 hours. I'll also be posting it on YouTube. Under the description, you will be able to find information about the CLE code and the link to the materials as well. The training was approved by the Florida Bar for one General CLE Credit and one Technology Credit. I'll announce the CLE code towards the end of the session, and as I mentioned, I will also include it in the Zoom email, and it will also be in the YouTube description as well. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. If you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, or PILS. If you're not familiar with PILS, I highly encourage you to take a look at their website, look at all of our work groups. It's a pretty cool section. Right? There's a lot of benefits, including a lot of DCLEs that we co-host with Florida Legal Services. So check them out, follow them on social media. They do great work. Final piece of housekeeping announcements are questions and answers. If you do have questions, you can either use the chat or the Q&A. If the question is related to the topic at hand, I'll probably let Anne know so we can address the question. If for whatever reason there are questions that remain unanswered, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible towards the end. So with all that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our amazing speaker today, Anne Ray. Anne is the interim director of the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, a free online source of data on affordable housing needs and supply. Since joining the Chamber Center in 2001, she also has performed research on public housing, preservation of affordable rental housing, energy efficiency, and the affordable housing stock, the housing needs of persons with disabilities, farm worker housing, homelessness among Florida children and youth, and the low-income housing tax credit. Anne Ray is responsible for producing the center's triennial statewide rental market study and has co-authored numerous reports on statewide and local housing needs. Anne received a bachelor's in history from the University of Michigan and a master's in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to pass it over to Anne. Anne, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Jorge. Really enjoyed working with Jorge and probably many of you over the years to respond to questions about affordable housing in the state of Florida. So that introduction actually covered a lot of it, but just to go over real quick what we do at the Shimberg Center. So I'm the interim director of the center, and mostly my role is to manage the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse. And the Schimberg Center is at University of Florida. We're in the Rinker School of Construction Management, College Design, Construction, and Planning. And we were established by the legislature in 1988 to serve as a multidisciplinary research center on affordable housing. We do work on affordable housing design, policy, and we've had the data clearinghouse. I've just been going through some old papers as we've been doing an office move, and really a lot of what we've been doing is since the 90s, put into place to support local comprehensive plans for affordable housing. We launched our website around 2000, 2001, and you'll have that, Jorge has dropped a link to the chat in that. Over the time that I've been with the Schimberg Center, which is most of the time that the clearinghouse has been online, I've really found that legal assistance attorneys have been one of the most helpful contacts for me in understanding what's actually happening on the ground in affordable housing. The questions that you ask us really are helpful in our understanding of what is happening in housing, what information is useful to provide. So, I'm going to talk specifically about our assisted housing inventory, which is our database of subsidized affordable rental housing developments in the state. But I really encourage everybody to check out the whole data clearinghouse. If we have a little extra time at the end, I'll go over some of the other information besides the assisted housing inventory that we have there. And mostly, I really encourage you to reach out to the center, to me, if you have any questions, if you're trying to use the site and you're having any difficulty with it, or if there's something that you don't see that we might be able to provide. We do a lot of custom data requests as well. And again, here it's very much a two-way street. It's very helpful for us to hear from others, what information is most helpful. The Housing Data Clearinghouse is sponsored by Florida Housing Finance Corporation, which is our state's housing finance agency. And you'll see as we go through these slides that the assisted housing inventory and our affordable rental supply in general really relies very heavily on Florida Housing Finance Corporation, or just Florida Housing for short. And they really are the major funder of affordable housing, particularly in the continued production of affordable rental housing in the state. So just to give you some ideas of what I want to go over today, I know some of you probably have a lot of experience with these housing programs. Some of you may be new to this. So I just want to give you an idea of what assisted rental housing is and how we think about it. Those are the programs that are included in our assisted housing inventory, which is one of the major data sets in the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse. So I want to demo for you what tools are available on our data clearinghouse that will allow you to find information about the affordable housing stock in your area in general, and about specific properties, and also, the income and rent limits that apply to these properties. A lot of our work in assisted housing, and really the impetus for us gathering such detailed information about the assisted housing inventory, much more detailed property information than we have about any other type of housing in Florida, is because there are risks to the inventory. So I want to give people an understanding of preservation risks, what it means to keep that kind of housing in the inventory over the long term, and what it means that in many cases, these are time-limited affordability restrictions. And then, as I said, if we have a little extra time, I can talk too about what else is in the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, but you can always take a look at our site, and in the slides it'll cover some of those other topics, even if we don't talk about them today. Okay, so just to take a step back and say, what is assisted housing? And we kind of have two nested groups of housing properties here. A lot of times when people think about affordable housing or subsidized housing, they'll just throw out the term public housing. It's definitely what you'll see kind of in the popular media or in discussions. The traditional public housing program, so that's housing that is the federal program that was created by the National Housing Act in the late 1930s. That is what people think of when they think of affordable rental housing, actually represents a pretty small share of the subsidized rental housing that we have in the state of Florida. So the public housing program, which is governed by the Office of Public and Indian Housing at HUD, where the housing is owned by local public housing authorities. There's just over 200 developments with about 24,000 units statewide. And almost a third of those are in Miami-Dade County. We really haven't produced affordable or public housing since the mid-1980s, other than some replacement housing. And so particularly for communities that have developed more recently, our public housing stock is pretty small. What we would refer to it as assisted housing, although we do also include public housing in our assisted housing inventory, is more than 10 times the size. And that's developments that are privately owned for the most part, either by for-profit or nonprofit organizations, and in Florida, actually primarily by for-profit organizations. Properties where the owner receives public subsidies, either for construction, operating costs, or both, and in exchange, there are income and rent restrictions placed on all or a portion of the units in the property. And there's almost 3,200 developments either in operation or funded, with over 324,000 assisted units. And we refer to assisted units as the ones that are rent and income restricted. So sometimes there's a mixed income development, there's market rate units there too. But you see, it's just a much larger stock of housing. By far, the largest funder of that housing is Florida Housing Finance Corporation. As I mentioned, they fund almost 80% of the units in the state. But our assisted housing inventory covers Florida Housing Finance Corporation, properties funded by HUD's multifamily programs, by HUD's public housing program that I mentioned, by USDA's Rural Development or RD program, which is kind of like HUD, but for rural communities and small towns, and some bond financing by local housing finance authorities, in most cases layered onto that Florida Housing Finance Corporation. We did a report about assisted, if you just want to learn about what assisted housing is and some of the characteristics of it, some of which I'm going to include in our discussion today. We did a report at the end of last year called The State of Florida's Assisted Rental Housing. So if you wanted, if you'd like to read over sort of more interpretation of what we're seeing, as opposed to just looking up the data on our website, we have a link to that. So the term assisted housing really covers a wide range of affordable rental housing. There can be quite a difference between, an older public housing or HUD development versus a brand new low-income housing tax credit development. And what happens at that, both how the housing operates and who it serves are really governed by the funding programs in place, by the funders and the funding programs, and the restrictions that are placed on those properties through land use restriction agreements, or LURAs, that are recorded at the county. And the funding involved and the LURAs will govern how deep the affordability is. So what households it targets. We express that household income in terms of percentage of area median income. I'll show you an example later, but if you hear 30% AMI, 60% AMI, 80% AMI, those are published limits. And those are usually units are set aside for different AMI percentages. Whether it targets a particular tenant population, so generically we'll say families, and those are really developments that you don't have to be literally related individuals. In fact, you can have a one-person family, but whether it generally targets families or whether there's specific set-asides for elders, for people with disabilities, for people experiencing homelessness, and so forth. How long the property has to remain affordable. In the case of public housing, it's in perpetuity, but a lot of other programs have some kind of length of affordability. And once that period of affordability ends, or we'll call it subsidy expiration, what happens? And our assisted housing inventory includes properties that have funding from any of the funders that I mentioned on the last slide. So Florida Housing, HUD, both multifamily and public housing, USDA, and local housing authorities. And we integrate that information. So if a property has many layers of financing, which they often do from different funders, that we're mentioning each of those. So some of these restrictions and some of these, particularly the length of affordability and the depth of affordability, are layered on as well. So it's helpful to use the assisted housing inventory because you can then find out kind of what are the most restrictive, what are the longest restrictions going forward, what's the deepest income targeting going forward. So in this idea that not all assisted housing is created equal, that the term assisted housing and our affordable rental inventory really covers a wide range of types of housing. There are a couple generations of housing and that really reflect that length and depth of affordability. And so our first generation of housing programs had they were largely funded and operated, or governed rather, by the federal government, by HUD in particular, and by USDA a little bit later. And they involve the provision of deep federal rental assistance. So the big difference between generation 1 and generation 2 is that for generation 1, the deeply federally subsidized housing, rent tends to be based on the occupant's income. So somebody moves into the unit, they pay 30% of their income for the rent and utilities. If their income changes, that rent adjusts. If they move out and a new tenant moves in, the rent amount changes. And so because typically that's not enough to support the operations of a public housing development or some of these deeply subsidized, privately owned, but federally subsidized developments, the federal government then by some mechanism provides ongoing operating support to make up a larger rent level to the owner. This includes the traditional public housing program, where the federal government is providing a capital and operating subsidy to the local public housing authorities so that if somebody's paying $250 or $300 a month for rent, there's more operating funds that allow that property to exist. For the HUD and USDA multifamily housing, which is a larger supply of privately owned but publicly subsidized housing, That's an arrangement that the federal government has under contract directly with the private owner of that housing. So we've got, as I said, about 24,000 public housing units in the state, but we've got about 71,000 HUD and USDA multifamily units that are, for the most part, privately owned, but receive that ongoing operating subsidy so that tenants can pay 30% of their income for their housing. And then larger than those actually is our housing choice voucher program. We, for the most part, do not include vouchers in the assisted housing inventory in that database, although some tenants are using vouchers in, say, Florida housing units. But we've got about 109,000 housing choice vouchers from HUD in the state. So those go from HUD to public housing authorities, and tenants take them to a private landlord. And so while everything we have in our assisted housing inventory is project-based, so you're saying, if a new tenant moves in, then that new tenant receives the subsidy and the rent changes based on their income. With a voucher, it's the opposite. Wherever the individual tenant goes, they go to a new unit, they take that voucher with them. So this represents the deeply subsidized stock that we have in the state. And because there's that deep subsidy, most residents are extremely low income. We define ELI or extremely low income generally as being below 30% of the area median income. In practice, actually, a lot of the people who live in public housing and in these deeply subsidized HUD and USDA developments have incomes that are quite a bit lower than that. And in particular, our HUD multifamily stock in Florida is heavily made up of projects that are directed at elderly residents. If you see a nonprofit owned elderly high rise in a downtown area, a lot of those are HUD multifamily developments. The average tenant income for those is only around $15,000 a year. Are more working age people who are living in public housing or getting vouchers. So the average income is around $20,000, but still very, very, very low income levels. And that means that people are paying, because their income is the rent's based on their income rather, they're paying anywhere from $300, $350, maybe $500 or $600 a month for rent. So well below what their units would cost in the private market. And that deep ongoing federal rental assistance is what makes that possible. So that's how we developed affordable rental housing. A combination of HUD and RD subsidized mortgages, and then this ongoing rental assistance. That's really how we did housing in the 1960s through 80s for the HUD programs, more like the 70s, built 70s through the 90s for the RD programs. Most of that the addition to the deeply subsidized stock, HUD really hasn't funded very many new units since the mid-1980s, a handful of pretty limited projects for elders or people with disabilities since then. The RD stock, again, mostly dates back to the 1990s and before. So we're not adding a lot of these. We're adding very few. The second generation of our assisted housing stock, and most of what we've built from the 1990s up until now and continue to build, are the Florida housing properties. With the low-income housing tax credit, which was created in 1987 and really got going in the 90s. With SAIL, which is the State Apartment Incentive Loan Program, that's Florida Housing's own funding. If you've heard of the Sadowski funds, those are the state housing trust funds that Florida Housing itself allocates for gap funding for development of affordable rental housing, and some bond financing that can go along with these programs. This is how we build affordable rental housing now. And we're still adding units and actually still going quite strong. We've been in the past few years close to record levels of production, building about 10,000 new units a year. The difference between those and the older programs is this is construction financing, so it's not that ongoing rental support. Most of these units target up to 60% of area median income, so they tend to target a little higher income level. And the rents are based on that 60% AMI ceiling, or whatever percent AMI ceiling, whatever the set aside is, regardless of the tenant's income. So that means that in some cases, and often in many cases, residents of these properties still could be paying more than 30% of their income for their housing. and the rent doesn't automatically adjust when their income changes or when somebody new moves in. This is, this has been our country's major rental housing production for affordable housing since its introduction, the low-income housing tax credit. So just in the properties that don't also have one of the other funding sources that I mentioned before, we've got about 213,000 affordable units. So again, a much larger stock that we're still adding to. We cut into those a little bit with losses of expiring properties every year, but for the most part, we're having a net positive gain of these. And noting that these units are on properties without those other funding sources, again, a lot of times there can be layering of financing sources. So let's say one of these older HUD properties has gotten FHFC funding later for rehab, or some, particularly the rural development properties. Many of them are a partnership between Florida Housing using its tax credits and USDA using its mortgage financing and ongoing rental assistance. So there are plenty of properties that have both. There's also a lot of FHFC tenants who are in properties without project-based assistance, but they're using vouchers to make those units affordable for them. And in fact, tax credit developments are not allowed to discriminate based on source of income. So they can be, even if they are not as deeply affordable, the development of more tax credit housing can be a really good tool to give voucher holders a place to go to search for housing. But the sort of generic, mostly family, 60% AMI units where tenants are paying that full rent, that's how we develop new affordable housing for the most part now. And the average tenant income for those is a little bit higher, around 30,000 for Florida housing units. Or if we look just at the households who aren't using any kind of rental assistance, no voucher, no partnership on the building with HUD or RD, about 36,000. Incomes, not surprisingly, tend to be lower for households that do get that rental assistance. They also tend to be lower for elderly tenants. But on average, the tenants' incomes are about 35% of varying median income. So you notice it's higher, but it's nowhere near the 60% AMI that many of these units have a top at. There's more income variation across Florida Housing's portfolio, this Generation 2 portfolio of affordable housing. Still about a third of the tenants have incomes below $20,000. Again, many elders, many who are using some kind of rental assistance. About a quarter of them have incomes above $40,000. And the average rents across the board are a little over $1,000 a month. So what you see is that, while these units, the rents are quite a bit higher, the incomes are not necessarily that much higher than in the other ones. And talk a little bit about why that is. So before I do that, though, any questions about just the description of what assisted housing is and what we include in our assisted housing inventory before I get to the tool itself?
If anybody has any questions, they can drop them in the chat. I don't see any questions yet. I had like a quick power outage, and so if you saw like a weird message, but
Welcome
I'm
back.
back.
All right.
Let's see. I don't see anything in the chat, so I guess you can go on. If I see any questions come in, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Okay. And some of the details about how assisted housing works will become more clear when I show you what our tool is. So as I mentioned, we started collecting the assisted housing inventory is one of the core data sets of our data clearinghouse. Local governments, for their comp plans, were required to catalog their supply of local affordable housing and keep an eye on it. Also, a lot of communities, not just in Florida, but elsewhere, were starting to really try and come up with some kind of integrated data set that showed assisted housing from different funders at the state and at the federal level. Back in the 90s, as some of the earliest HUD properties started to reach the end of their affordability periods, and people were realizing that they didn't even have an inventory where they could say, what housing do we have? What's at risk of loss? Our assisted housing inventory, I think, was not the first, but one of the first to have all these different programs from this integrating the state and federal data. And also, because this is sponsored by Florida Housing, we've been able to get a lot of information from them about both properties and the tenants who live in the properties. So we have one of the most detailed statewide databases. And it was one of the models for, there's now a national housing preservation database that has information about properties across the country. Our data clearinghouse and our assisted housing inventory was one of the models for that. And because we have access to state information, ours is still a little more detailed at the state level than what you would find on the national one. At any rate, you can see this is the homepage for our data clearinghouse. If you've used it before, we've actually just upgraded mostly what's happening kind of under the hood. So most things work the same, but it might look slightly different than what you've seen before. These are the different topics that we cover in the data clearinghouse right now. Jorge just dropped a link to the assisted housing inventory in the chat. That's what would happen if you clicked on this assisted housing inventory tab at the top. But basically, our clearinghouse works the same way, no matter which of these topics you're interested in. And you have two ways to get into the data. We tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. One is that you can go to these drop-downs on our homepage, and you can pick one place, either a city, a county, or the state. Just type it in, start typing, and it'll probably autofill for you. And then pick one topic. They're the same as the ones at the top, and hit search. So if you're just interested in one place, you want to get there quick, particularly if you're interested in a city and you don't feel like drilling down to all these different levels, that's the easiest way to get there. If you're interested in picking more than one place, or you're not sure where you want to look at, you can click one of the topics at the top of the page, assisted housing here, and it will come up with a list of all the counties. You open up that list of counties, and if you click on the plus next to any county, it will open up to all the cities in that county plus the unincorporated area. And then you click next. In any case, it gets you to the same place. So in this case, because we chose assisted housing and I chose Brevard County on the previous page, you get to our assisted housing inventory results page. Jorge has the link in the chat, so feel free to sort of try this out as we're talking, but I tried to just cut and paste some things so you could see some of the things that you'll find on the site. If you click this little show table list on the left side of the page, it'll show you everything we have in the assisted housing inventory page, and it'll let you jump around between tables. If you just want to get the data and be done with it, you can download it as an Excel workbook, and that will put everything on the page into one workbook. Each table will be one tab on that. So the first thing we have in the assisted housing inventory is just a summary of the count of units and properties by funder, and then the total for all funders. So as I mentioned, we're tracking properties from Florida Housing Finance Corporation, from HUD's multifamily programs, especially rental assistance. If there's a local housing finance authority that's offering mortgage revenue bonds, we'll have that. If there's public housing in the community you're looking at, either city or county, we'll have that. And then the total for all funders. And you'll notice that if you add all these numbers up, there's a lot more than 60 properties, and there's a lot more than 6,300 units. And that's because, again, a lot of properties will be funded by more than one funder. So we show you all the units in the property, including if there are any market rate. We add up all the assisted units that have some kind of income and rent restrictions. The HUD and RD rental assistance units is just what it sounds like. That's giving you the units that have that deep rental assistance associated with it, so that tenants paying no more than 30% of their income for their housing. And then public housing annual contributions contract units. Those are the traditional public housing units. So again, you see there's 787 public housing units in Brevard County, but there's over 6,100 units that have some kind of income and rent restrictions. So again, getting to, public housing actually is one of our smaller affordable housing programs. So that summary is the first thing on the page, but really the heart of the assisted housing inventory is the property list. This is a table that is much wider than any screenshot. You really have to scroll back and forth to see the whole thing, or just go ahead and download it into Excel so you can play around with the data a little bit, because we provide a tremendous amount of information about each individual property. So you'll see here just where we start, you have information about where the property is, whatever the combination of funders is. So here's an example of a property that has funding both from Florida Housing Finance Corporation and from HUD. Here's all the funding programs and the number of units. But again, this goes on and on and on to give you an idea of what's in there. And again, if people want to play around with it, we have information about the property. So the name, address, and location. There's also information about what census tract it's in. There's some geocoding information, particularly for the Florida housing units, how many developments, how many units there are by bedroom count, when it was built. And then for HUD properties, the REAC inspection scores. So that's the only one where we have good information about physical inspection scores. That's something we'd really like to add to. Very detailed information about funding programs. So both which of those four or five major funders, but also the individual programs, as I showed you. And then for each one, when does it start? So when was it funded? When does it end? And then what's the overall governing expiration date? So what's the absolute latest expiration date? Because different programs will expire at different time. When do all income and rent restrictions burn off the property? About affordability, for most properties, we have the average rent, and particularly for FHFC, that's what the tenants are paying for rent and utilities. And for the Florida housing units, what the set-asides are by AMI. So maybe it's a property that has most of its 60% AMI, but some of them are 80, some are 30. We'll have that breakdown. If there's a special target population, we'll list that. And then we have information about the actual tenants living in the unit. So not just it's targeting seniors, but what percentage of people living in the development, whether it targets seniors or not, actually are elders? What percentage are children? What's the average income, and what's the income breakdown of the tenants in the property? And then finally, we have information about the owner of the property, where it's provided from the funder. We have the name and address or some kind of contact information, either for the current owner of the property or for who developed it originally. We have an owner type. For-profit versus nonprofit is the main thing, but we also have, there are some limited development corporations, or limited dividend corporations, excuse me, for the RD properties. And then sometimes public housing authorities will own properties that are not public housing. We'll have that as well. And we have information about when and for how much the property sold last. So I see a couple questions. Yeah, I can address the questions.
This next question is related to the previous slide, which is, there used to be a way to filter county results by name without downloading as an Excel sheet. Is that feature gone? I can't find it now. I liked it because I could enter the property name and see all the column headers directly in line with the row. It's hard to match up the row and column otherwise.
Yeah, that will be back. Hopefully, I was asking our web developer about that yesterday. Yeah, that's part of our redoing the site. We are going to bring that back, and I agree that was a really useful. So before, when you were here, when that table list was closed, you would see this big panel that allowed you to filter the results in this property list. You could look for an individual property name. You could filter by expiration dates. You could filter by funder. There were a few different, I think you could filter by year the property was built or funded. So we are bringing that back. It's just going to take a little while because of this redevelopment. In the meantime, it's kind of an imperfect solution, but when I'm doing that, it doesn't help if you're kind of lining up the results. But one thing I'll do is just search for the name of the place on the page. But the easiest thing might be to just download it into a spreadsheet at this point and filter the spreadsheet so you can see everything. But yes, we will bring that back. It's not back yet. Jorge, any other questions that I see the ones in the chat?
That was in the Q&A. Let me double check the chat just in case.
Okay.
Here we go. There's one question about where would the home program fall?
Yeah, so great question. So this is an example of something where we have some information, but not all of it. If the property got home dollars from the state, so there are some home dollars that Florida Housing Finance Corporation makes available, then we'll have that under housing programs. And it'll say the FHFC is one of the funders. If they got local home dollars, we generally do not have that information. So that brings up a really important point about our assisted housing inventory, which is that It covers the sources that I talked about pretty completely, with a couple exceptions I get into, but Florida Housing Finance Corporation, HUD Public Housing, HUD Multifamily, USDA Rural Development, and local bond financing. For local sources, if you have an affordable housing trust fund in town, if a property got CDBG or home dollars, if it got SHIP funding, there are other things that are available locally, not on a statewide basis, Miami-Dade surtax, that also impose income and rent restrictions, inclusionary zoning programs. Now, newly, there's Live Local Act. So we're not comprehensive in that. If it's a local source other than bond financing, we generally don't have it. However, that's something that we want to work on. That's kind of a next phase of looking to expand the program. So again, if it got home dollars from the state, you'll see it under housing programs. If it got home dollars from the city, it may be a development that shows up in this database, but you won't see the home funding.
Here's another great question. Should we contact Shimberg if it seems that the subsidized property is using a different name than you see in the database?
Sure. So sometimes we'll go ahead and change those. Sometimes we won't. A lot of times we'll sort of work out. We kind of have a hierarchy where we kind of take Florida Housing's data first, then HUD, or I'm not exactly sure what the order is, but sometimes a property will be listed as 3 phases from one funder and 1 phase or another, or they've changed the name. So we would probably keep going with whatever we're getting from Florida Housing and then these other sources as a definitive source. But we definitely make mistakes and they make mistakes. So it's always a good idea to contact us about those.
And then going back, like when I used to use this tool like every day. One thing that I would do when I was here in this page, I would use Control Find, and if I didn't get a hit on the property name, I would also try the address and sometimes just the street address, not necessarily using the numbers, just to see if I would get a hit that would be close. Because in this example, you might see 1165 Jordan Road, but maybe your client is in Jordan Road, but it just has another building number, but it's still part of the property. So that's what I used to do, is just Control Find to try to get it near, and then I would see that, okay, that is definitely the same property.
And another thing for that, what we're adding what we have now and what we're adding very soon, there is, if you go to the maps and visualizations page, we're making some changes to that, but there is currently a map of all the AHI developments. It's a little hard to keep that up. So one thing that we're launching very soon is you'll have the option that when you get to this table to toggle back and forth between a map and the list. So another thing you can do is look by the location. And Jorge, that would be an example of, well, oh, I know where this place is. How come I don't see it here? You'd see a dot on a map. So that's coming really soon, where you'd be able to see both like at the county level or the city level how many developments there are, but also you'd just be able to go back and forth between a table and a map right here. And then there's one more question about how often the data is updated. Everything on our site almost everything on our site is updated at least annually. In the case of the assisted housing inventory, we update it quite a bit more than that, and it depends on the funding source. For USDA and the local housing finance authorities, it's still just once a year. For the HUD development, it's whenever they come out with a new update to their Section 8 database, which is tracking the multifamily. And from Florida Housing Finance Corporation, we get new information at least quarterly. And what you'll see, Florida Housing and to some extent the local housing finance authorities are really the only funders where properties are still being built. So what we're adding to the stock really comes from them. And particularly with the Florida housing stock, you'll see in this table, there's an occupancy status or a property status, something like that, that says either occupancy or ready for occupancy or not ready for occupancy. So we will actually have developments that are in the development pipeline, but have not been built or open for tenants yet. So we get the information after the properties are funded. Okay. I want to mention one other piece of information on our site. I mentioned this before about what AMI is that can be really helpful. And that's, we publish income and rent limits. So you would go back to the top of the page, click income and rent limits, choose the county that you're interested in. These are set either at the metro or the county level. And then you'll get above this on the page, you'd see HUD's fair market rents, which can be helpful. But in particular, these three tables that have the HUD median family income, which is what they publish, and we're about to update these to 2026. And then Florida Housing Finance Corporation's income and rent limits. So what does it mean to be a two-person household who has an income of 50% of AMI or less? It means that your income's below $39,850 if you're in Brevard County. Or what's the rent limit, including utilities or a utility allowance for a two-bedroom apartment in Brevard County right now? $1,345 a month. So combined income, combined rent and utilities can't be above that in a 60% AMI unit if it's a two-bedroom unit. And it's really important to use these Florida housing published limits, which are also based on HUD's income limits, very minor changes to them. If you want to say this is what 50% of AMI is or 80% of AMI is, and adjust them for these household size. A lot of times people will take a percentage of this number and it's just not very helpful. There's a lot of tweaks that go from getting from this number to all these different household sizes. So these tables can be really helpful if you want to know exactly what's governing what it means to have a two-bedroom unit that's limited to 60% of AMI in a particular county. And the other thing that's important to know about these AMI limits is that they have gone up a lot in the past few years. And what that means is that there are more tenants who are eligible for these properties. And also, in particular, the maximum rent is much higher. And this is something that we do hear from legal assistance attorneys about quite a bit, is that people are getting rent increases. So just to give you an idea over the past few years, because median family incomes, and that includes everybody, that includes a millionaire homeowner, that includes a senior in a HUD housing development who gets a Social Security check. But because there have been so many higher income households added on, these AMI limits are going up quite a bit. So just to take Brevard County as an example, back in 2021, a 60% AMI two-bedroom, which if you had to pick one example of a housing unit is probably the most common kind of subsidized housing, they were allowed to charge $981 a month in 2021. They're allowed to charge over $1,300 now. And the income limit for that household is up to nearly $48,000, up from $35,000. And that's why you see that the AMI of households, even in developments that aren't deeply subsidized, is pretty low. The tenants tend to have incomes at 30% AMI, 40% AMI, even if they're in a 60% AMI unit. That was always the case, but now AMIs are quite a bit higher. And also, because rents are higher in general, much higher in general than they were just a few years ago, properties that might not have been charging that maximum $1,300 something a month or that maximum $1,000 a month for their studio are now able to do so. So you may very well be hearing from residents who are seeing large rent increases either year to year or even at the point where these new rent limits are published, which this year was in early May and typically is in early April. So that's, I think, a key change that's been happening. You just think inflation, everything has gotten more expensive, rents have gotten more expensive. That's happened in assisted housing too, in part because incomes globally have gone up, even if they haven't gone up a lot for tenants in affordable housing. So I want to shift while we have time just to talk about I mentioned that we want to talk about the risk to assisted housing, that we have done a tremendous amount in a pretty short period of time to build up our assisted housing inventory in the state of Florida. Florida has the largest state housing trust fund in the country with the Sadowski funds. We've been able to provide a lot of gap financing and we've had a lot of population growth in general. And we've really used these federal tools, particularly the low-income housing tax credit, to supercharge the development of affordable housing. But other than the public housing program, in general, those are time limited. And so one risk to assisted housing is just that these affordability restrictions are going to expire. Another is that for some programs, particularly rental assistance, the owner has the opportunity to opt out of the programs and convert the housing to market rate or use the property for something else at the end of a rental assistance contract. And then a third possibility, and these things can coexist, is that you have properties that are older, that are failing, that are either failing to provide decent housing for tenants, or they're actual risk of default because they're in some kind of financial default, or they're in such poor condition that the funding agency cuts off its subsidies. So we have a lot of information in the assisted housing inventory that can help you assess that risk, particularly the risk for the loss of the housing due to expiration. We have detailed information about funding programs. If you scroll farther over, you're going to see when each of these properties starts and ends. We have when the property was built, so you can see if it's maybe aging into some kind of, if the conditions are good, if it's gotten, you maybe want to look at whether, a property that was built in 1953, you're going to hope has had some rehab since then. And for properties that do expire, and notice the public housing one does not, we'll have an overall year of subsidy expiration. Sometimes we can cry wolf a little bit because one of these programs is expiring, but it turns out that there are other subsidy layers that help keep the property affordable longer. So we come up with it. It's an estimated date, whatever we're getting from the funders, and sometimes they revise those, but an estimated overall date of funding expiration. If you look at that report I posted at the beginning, what we calculated is, this is starting with 2024. By the end of 2034, rent and income restrictions over a 10-year period were going to expire for over 400 developments with about 33,000 assisted units. That's a pretty big, while we're continuing to produce much more than that, and sometimes people will say, oh, we're losing more housing than we're generating. No, we're still building quite a bit more than we're losing. But there are properties that are starting to cycle out of the inventory, particularly because very early tax credit program properties that were built in the 90s are hitting their first 30-year federal end of restrictions. And because a lot of that activity happened in the Orlando area, so in Orlando, Osceola, Seminole, Lake counties, that's an area that's disproportionately affected by these expiration of rent and income restrictions. So our early generation 2 housing, mostly for-profit owned, mostly family properties, mostly targeting tenants at 60% AMI, are starting to hit those 30-year restrictions. And then we also continually have housing from HUD and from USDA that are hitting the end of their restrictions. And as I've mentioned, that means different things depending on who funded the property. And you have to look at all the funders, right? Because you might have some overlapping things that are protective because there's HUD funding, but there's also Florida housing funding, say. As we look at how our housing stock grows or shrink, it's really only that generation 2, Florida housing and local housing finance authorities, that are still producing new units. So while the HUD units and USDA units, well, the HUD units anyway, might have some protection, we're also not adding to that stock. And because they're the ones that have the deep rental assistance, when we do lose one of these units, there's a loss of a truly affordable unit. All of the programs that I mentioned, except for public housing, have some kind of expiration of affordability period. There are, some properties now where we talk about keeping them affordable in perpetuity, or putting a 99-year affordability period on them, which is the longest that, that I think can be done by law. But in general, only public housing has perpetuity of its affordability built in. And the HUD properties that have rental assistance have something special, which is that they have these contracts that can be renewed. And most of the time, owners of HUD properties do renew that contract. So when you see a HUD multifamily rental assistance expiring contract, it's not that assistance is instantly going to go away, but it's an inflection point where the owner may decide not to renew the contract. USDA kind of has the worst of all worlds in that the affordability period expires. They have deep rental assistance, but once the mortgage that was used from USDA is either prepaid or matures, the rental assistance that goes along with that mortgage ends. USDA has had a pilot to basically make things work the same way they do at HUD, where the owner could continue to renew that contract. And there is, in federal housing legislation that's been moving through Congress, that movement to decouple the rental assistance from the RD mortgages. So essentially to have things work the same way they do at HUD. has been moving through. But for right now, where we're starting to see the termination of a lot of those early HUD or early USDA properties, that's a real vulnerability because you have very low income tenants, a lot of them elder, who have been getting deep rental assistance that's no longer available. So just to take us through some examples of what I was just describing, here are 3 properties where if you look on our site, they'll say overall date of expiration, subsidy expiration is 2027. But what happens next is quite a bit different depending on who those funders are. And in this case, I've chosen ones where there's just one of these funders. If you have them overlapping, then things might be a little bit more protective. So this is an example of a property in Daytona Beach and one of those early tax credit properties. It got 9% low-income housing tax credits in 1995 with a 30-year land use restriction. For-profit, family property. Basically, once it hits the end of that 30 years, there's really nothing that they can do to renew that financing or renew the affordability restrictions other than to get new tax credits or some other kind of financing that continues to, that imposes a new period of affordability. So that's how some of these early generation 2 properties that are just now starting to hit 30 years. It's 1995, often 30 years plus 2, because it's from the date they actually open, and it typically takes a couple of years for the property to get built. Here's a HUD property that probably has been renewing rental assistance contracts several times since most of the HUD properties are older. In this case, it's a nonprofit-owned development in Fort Lauderdale that serves elderly tenants that has a 10-year rental assistance contract that's going to expire in 2027. And that's a situation where the owner has the option to renew the contract, typically for up to 20 years, although some of them might renew for 1, might renew for 5, might renew for 10. And so that's that 2027, that assistance could continue and typically does, especially if you have a nonprofit mission-driven owner. But it's also possible that that's a point where the owner decides to opt out. And at that point, the restrictions on the property end, the people who are living there at the time get vouchers, but those units are no longer available to new tenants. And they can convert the property to market rate, they can convert it to some other use entirely, they can demolish it, the land use restrictions are removed. It's often protective that there's a nonprofit owner, but not all of the time. Sometimes there's a nonprofit that decides it doesn't want to be in the housing business anymore, or the property is really troubled and they can't really see a way to move forward and to keep it viable. Again, a lot of these properties were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it might be an organization that just has different priorities now. And then again, as I was saying, kind of the worst of all worlds scenarios is a USDA property. They tend to be smaller. So here's a 24-unit property in Williston. Their mortgage, Section 515, is the subsidized mortgage program that USDA provides or provided. That mortgage is going to mature in 2027. At that point, the rental assistance and the affordability restrictions will end. And unless we do that rental assistance decoupling, there's not going to be an option to renew. And oftentimes, that may be in smaller communities, that may be one of the only multifamily developments that they have. And so we're starting to see some snowballing of the loss of USDA properties. On the other hand, a lot of those properties had tax credits. And so there's an example of something where you have a kind of protective layer, extending affordability, maybe not the deep affordability that you get with rental assistance, but extending the affordability to an extent. Just looking year over year, those expirations are going to spike in the early 2030s, especially in 2024. Mostly because of the expiration of some of those 30-year restricted properties, either that got Florida Housing financing or a mix of local Housing Finance Authority and Florida Housing. There's also, kind of a snowballing expiration of HUD properties, but again, those have the option to renew. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's definitely a time to keep an eye on it. You've probably heard about if you're following this, and particularly if you're following it at the national level, you've probably heard of this idea that there's going to be this cliff where the early 1990s developments, the first tax credit developments that we've done, are all hitting 30 years. And so we're going to start losing units as fast as we're building them, or we're going to lose most of our older LIHTC and Generation 2 properties. That's not going to happen in Florida because Florida Housing has put in a lot of investments to switch most properties to 50 years of affordability. So in most cases, properties who are going in for anything they have to compete for at Florida Housing really need to commit to 50 years of affordability, not 30. In some cases, Florida Housing has, in many cases, they've looped back to provide additional funding so that something that would have been expiring now is not. And, I mentioned before that we were coming up to about 33,000 units expiring for all the programs. If they hadn't done that 30 to 50 year extension, we'd be looking at least 67,000 more units that would have been lost in now less than a decade. So we do have a cliff. We do have a problem, particularly in Orange County, but and the Orlando area, but it's not nearly as bad as it would have been if it had not been for these policy interventions. So it's also, something that advocates have really fought for, to continue having these 50 years restrictions. And what that means is that we've shifted some of the risk now, right? So we're less concerned maybe about losing many of these 30-year properties, but we do have to look at what kind of investments you need in order to keep properties viable for 50 years. So, if a property is going to be affordable, collecting below market rents, the deeply subsidized properties, a lot of them are hitting 30 years. But also a lot of those Generation 2 are going to be starting to pass 30 years, 40 years of affordability. And it means that they're going to need some investment to continue to serve people, and especially to serve them well in good condition. I'm just going to skip quickly because I know we're running out of time, but I can come back to some of this if we want to the idea of preservation. So if we have risks either of the affordability period expiring, or property conditions deteriorating, or often both of those things, preservation is what keeps properties serving tenants well and in the assisted housing inventory. And preservation includes bringing in new subsidized financing. So I mentioned some of those older properties in the Florida Housing Generation 2 inventory have gotten new tax credits. So let's say they were supposed to expire in 2025. Now maybe they're going to expire in 2070. So new financing that restarts the clock in the affordability period. It provides funding to address capital needs in the development, because a property that's 15, 20, 30 years old is going to be pretty tired. And in many cases, particularly for the HUD deeply subsidized developments, it includes the sale of the property to a preservation-minded owner. There are a number of national nonprofits. There are a couple statewide entities where that's their business model, is to acquire these older, deeply subsidized properties, bring them up to modern standards, and commit to keeping them affordable long-term. So just want to close to make sure that we have some time for any last questions. We've kind of bounced back and forth a lot between focusing on preservation, focusing on new construction, back to preservation. There are some things that we can do, I think, to rebuild a preservation focus, where we've been very focused on new construction in our housing resources over the past several years. And really, I think attorneys tend to be on the front lines of this. You are often the first ones to hear from tenants when conditions are bad at a property, when people are hearing that their property is going to convert to market rate, that the affordability is limited. And so one thing is just to be sure to engage early with tenants and the owners of the properties. If there's a HUD contract expiring, find out, do they intend to renew it? If they are, can you encourage them to renew it for that 20-year period? There are some preservation resources available for older properties, and there's a focus on the deeply subsidized ones. So, finding out what owners' intentions are and seeking preservation resources if needed. If you have those non-renewable subsidies, so the Florida Housing, the rural development, the things that once the affordability period ends, can you go back to Florida Housing and other local funders to see if you can extend those affordability requirements? And then in the cases when neither, because preservation resources are really limited, when a property is converting to market rate, which does happen, because the owner doesn't want to do this anymore, because it's in such a strong market that it's not worth it to the owner anymore, because there's not resources available to preserve the property and bring it up to the standards where it needs to be. That's a time when tenants really need a lot of information, help with relocation, make sure that they're getting any kind of assistance that they're entitled to, whether it's a voucher that requires that they can't use at the property, whether ideally, whether it's a voucher they can use in their own property, if they're getting relocation assistance. But again, you all are really on the front lines and tend to be the bridge between tenants and the system that's available to preserve affordable housing or to protect them in the cases where it's not. So want to take any last minute questions. Happy to have folks get in touch with me. I know we're running out of time. If there's anything else, that information we can provide, help using the assisted housing inventory, happy to do so.
All right, thank you, Anne. I dropped the CLE code in the chat. I'm gonna read it out loud just in case. It's 2604984N. I'm also going to drop Anne's contact information. And with that, and there is one question that is I'm gonna skip one question and go to another one first because I think it kind of hits on this topic on reaching out to you. The question is, it starts with, thanks, Anne, for this great presentation. In Miami-Dade, we're seeing a lot of the Live Local Act workforce housing units being built. Is this one of the possible local expansions of the assisted housing inventory database you referenced earlier?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes. We're working with Florida Housing Coalition. If you go to Florida Housing Coalition's website, they have a map and dashboard of Live Local Act proposals. So, hasn't been that much built yet, but proposed properties now. And we're going to be looking at working with them to expand that. And when we have something that we feel like is comprehensive, yeah, we want to put that in the assisted housing inventory.
Okay, the next question is for the rent caps on low-income housing tax properties. Would you still need to reduce it by any approved utility allowance for the particular unit? In other words, the rent cap is pre-utility allowance reduction?
The rent cap includes the utility allowance. So if somebody has, let's say that the rent cap is $1,200 and there's a $100 utility allowance, then the rent paid to the landlord can be no more than $1,100.
All right, so Cody just dropped in the chat the Live Local dashboard. So thank you, Cody, for sharing it. I'll make sure to include that link in the materials and the email that goes out as well. So let me go ahead and copy it here.
Yeah, everybody go to Cody to ask your Live Local questions.
Yeah, Cody's great. Hi, Cody. So I see Pam Fields, you have your hand up. I don't know if I can actually bring you off mute. So if you want to ask a question. So anybody else has any questions? I know we're a little bit over time. So Pam, I don't know if you want to come off mute or not, but I'll try to, let's see. Okay, the hand is down, so it might have been inadvertent. So, okay, accidental, it happens. Um, I don't see any other pending questions, so I know we went a little bit over. I think it was expected, Anne, because I mean, if I could, I would spend more time with Anne asking a million questions and going through the database. Feel free. Anne has always been extremely helpful. Every time, we've run into anything. I remember during COVID, I asked Anne, like, hey, could we have like maybe a designated page for some of the properties that the CARES Act applies to? And it was amazing because we didn't have to go through the entire inventory. It was a lot. It was very easy to find. So, and has always been really helpful. Thank you for coming in today and sharing all your expertise and knowledge with us. Thank you, everybody that joined us. And this is going to be one of those webinars that we're going to include into that must-have toolkit for legal aid attorneys. So if you're a Housing Umbrella Group member, take a look at the document in a few days because we're going to add this training into this. If you have new staff members that join your organization, please share it with them so they know how to use this tool. So I see a thank you here in the chat. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.